Hello, welcome to the broadcast. I'm Billy Stewart, Assistant Pastor here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, 1325 Rudy Road in Alma, Arkansas. I just want to take a minute to extend this personal invitation to you to come and join us in one of our exciting spirit-filled services. Our Sunday school begins at 9 a.m. Our Sunday morning worship begins at 10 a.m. and our Sunday evening worship begins at 6 p.m. We also have an exciting Wednesday evening Bible study where we are going through the Bible book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. I think that you'll really enjoy it. Come and join us, won't you? 1325 Rudy Road here in Alma, Arkansas. Hey, we'll save a seat for you. And now, let's join our service already in progress.
All right. We finished Exodus. Woo! Yay. We're done with Exodus and we're getting into to Leviticus. So, Leviticus is going to go through basically the Levitical law. Now, the Levitical law, Levitical is not really a Hebrew word in itself. It has no Hebrew meaning on it. What Levitical comes from is the tribe of Levi, because that's where the priests come from. So it is, and a lot of the law pertains to what the priests have to do and all that. So they call it either the Mosaic law or the Levitical law. So that's what we're going to get into. But what is the Levitical law? Does anybody know? Yeah, okay. It's a certain standards. It's the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible basically is considered the Levitical law. But the Levitical law is divided into 3 different areas. Just like we have laws that are divided into 3 different ways on that. So is this. So we have the moral law. There's part of it in the Levitical law is called the moral law. Then there is the ceremonial law. Then there is the judicial law. Now, the moral law, that contains ethical principles that apply to everyone. Everybody has to follow these things. And it's based on God's holy character. Okay? And it's understood to be perpetually binding to all people. Now, what does perpetually mean? What do smart boys? What does perpetually mean? Carries on, carries over, it keeps going. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Everybody, it carries on from generation to generation to generation. The moral law perpetually goes constantly through. Now, then there's the ceremonial law, and this governs the worship rituals and the priestly duties for ancient Israel. It includes rituals like the sacrifices, festivals, purity regulations. There were certain things that they had to do. They couldn't. That was one of the big problems that they had trying to get Jesus buried after he was crucified, because you weren't allowed to touch a dead body for so many hours before the Sabbath, and so there was that going on. But it is intended to enable ancient Israel to worship God in his holiness. Okay? So these are laws that God set forth. And they serve as a shadow pointing to Christ. So the ceremonial law, and as we'll see as we get into Leviticus, a lot of it points to what Jesus is doing. The sacrifice, the law of the sacrifice, and all these point to Jesus. Then they have the judicial law. Now, the judicial law covers the social and civil life of the people of Israel, and they operated as a theocracy at that time. It is based on God is in charge, and then man, then you have Moses or the judges, as they went later on, that they were in charge of it. Okay? So that was the theocracy. And these laws are applicable to the context of Israel's specific relationship with God as a nation and Israel as a nation state. Now, you've seen the three types of laws. Which law did Jesus fulfill? Some of them, all of them? Okay, somebody said ceremonial. Anybody else have an idea? Huh? The judicial? Okay. All of them? Okay. Huh? Not all of them? Okay. All right. Now, Jesus said that not one jot or tittle of the law will pass away until it all be fulfilled. Okay? But he also said that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Now, this is where it gets really touching, because you have a lot of people in the world that will say that, well, if Jesus fulfilled the law, then we don't have to worry about all these things. Well, yeah, because Jesus did not fulfill the entire law at his first coming. At his second coming, he will. But at his first coming, he did not completely fulfill the entire law. The only law that he fulfilled at his first coming was a ceremonial law. The law that governs rituals, sacrifices, festivals, all of those things. Jesus fulfilled that portion of the law. All right? The moral law transcends the old covenant. In other words, it goes to today. We are still bound by the moral law, the Ten Commandments, okay? Those type of things. We're still bound by those laws. We still have to obey all 10 of the 10 Commandments. Not part of them, all of them, right? But we don't have to fulfill the sacrificial part of the law because Jesus did that, right? Now, the judicial law is still in effect also. But over the years, the judicial law has changed, as judicial laws will do. It doesn't, judicial laws usually don't stay the same. They're going to change. They're going to evolve, if you will, as you go along. Yeah, they change through different eras as they go along. The judicial laws change because Israel no longer operates as a theocracy. Israel is now a democracy, or a republic, like we are, but they're no longer a theocracy. They don't have, God is the head in charge of it, and then you have the king or the judges or people that, judge and do the things for God. It's a civilian or a civil government now rather than a religious government. So they are no longer a theocracy. Okay. Now, let's get into, so does that give you an idea of where we're at with the Levitical law right now? Okay, so when we're looking at this, the only portion of the Levitical law, the Mosaic law, that was fulfilled was the ceremonial part. We're still bound by the moral part. We're not bound. You and I aren't bound by the judicial part of the Mosaic law unless we go to Israel. Then we're bound by their law. Just the same as if anybody from Israel comes here, they're bound by our laws. Okay? So we're not bound by that over here in the United States because that's not an important part of it. What we are bound by the moral law, and we were bound by the ceremonial law until it was fulfilled.
Well, isn't the judicial law, isn't it about the same, like we have that,
Yeah,
judicial law?
we have our judicial laws as well. Yeah,
Morals,
yeah. And judicial, many times judicial law is based on moral principles. Okay? Now, I see a lot of times where people, because it does say in Leviticus that, like if let's say a woman is not a virgin when she gets married, she's supposed to be stoned. Okay? And and I hear people in the world are saying, well, okay, you're going to go out and stone this woman if she did? No. Why? Because although that is, to remain pure is part of the moral law, her being stoned was part of the judicial law. And that's changed. Just like every state in the Union used to have the death penalty, and they would hang everybody. Now, they don't. Only about 27 states have the death penalty, and they have a wide variety of different ways to execute people. And it goes on for years. Okay? So that's the judicial part of it. And you say, well, no, the judicial part of the law has changed over the years. The moral part of it remains the same. She was still wrong, morally wrong, but judicially she wasn't. It's just like if we have laws against speeding, right? If you speed, I don't know what the price of speeding is nowadays. It used to be like it was like $50 for 10 miles an hour over was $50, and then it was like $1 for every mile an hour over that, something like that, But yeah, now it's different. Well, it didn't change the fact that you still can't speed, but the punishment has changed. And that's the way it was there. It didn't, the moral part of it, what that person does is still wrong morally, but the judicial penalty has changed. That doesn't mean that God has changed. It's just that the judicial penalty for something has changed. That's all. Okay? So the moral law still exists. And whatever the morality of it was, that is what still applies. Not necessarily the punishment for that. All right? All right, let's get into Leviticus. Any more questions about the law part, or where we're at with the law and what the law is? All right. Let's get into Leviticus 1:1. And the Lord called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation. So the story of Leviticus picks up right where Exodus leaves off. Remember, Exodus left off with them building the tabernacle and the cloud of glory coming down into the tabernacle, and nobody could go into it because the glory of God was there. So this is where it picks up. The Lord speaks to Moses out of that. The people of Israel, the covenant descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were still camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. They're all still right there as this is going on. Okay? And they remained at Sinai throughout the entire period covered by the book of Leviticus. So as we go through Leviticus, through the book, keep in mind, they are still at the foot of Mount Sinai. They have not moved from there yet. They're still right there. Okay? Now it said that God spoke to Moses from the tabernacle of meeting. So this indicates that the tabernacle has been completed. It's done. It's been assembled. It's been put together. The last several chapters of Exodus, if you remember, described the construction of the tabernacle, how it was put together. Okay? But with the tabernacle of meeting complete, the sacrificial system can now be put into operation. They were now able to do the sacrifices that they're about to be instructed on how to do them. Okay? Now, in John 1:14, there is a deliberate link between the tabernacle of meeting and the incarnate Jesus Christ. So there's that direct correlation there. As the tabernacle of the meeting was a symbol of God's presence among his people, Jesus Christ was God present on earth. So the tabernacle of the meeting represented God's presence. His cloud of glory was there, but the incarnate Jesus was actually God on earth. He was here. All right. Verse 2. Spoke to Moses from the tabernacle meeting, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, If any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd, and of the flock. So, in the covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai, there were three major parts to this. Okay. The covenant included the law that Israel had to obey. It covered the sacrifice that was necessary for breaking the law, the payment for breaking the law, and the choice. They had a choice. They could either have a blessing or a curse. It was their choice. We have that same choice. We have the choice of either a blessing or a curse. We can follow, quote unquote, the law. We can follow the covenant that we are under and receive blessing, or we can reject it and receive curse. Either way, but it's our choice. God doesn't force himself on us. Okay? And that choice would become Israel's destiny all throughout history. Now, the sacrificial system was an essential element of the Mosaic covenant. And by Mosaic covenant, we mean the covenant that God made with Moses and therefore with the people of Israel, because it was impossible to live up to the requirements of the law. Let's face it, none of us here can live up to the requirements that we are supposed to live up to. None of us can live up to the quote-unquote requirements of being a Christian. None of us can do it. We can't. Why? Because we're flesh. We're humans. We're going to be tempted. We're going to go astray in different ways. So we can't live up to it. So since we can't live up to the requirements of it, and no one can perfectly obey the law, then sin had to be dealt with through sacrifice. That's how they dealt with it. Fortunately for us, we no longer have to offer sacrifice as far as animals. We don't have to bring our animal into the altar up here and sacrifice an animal every Sunday or whenever. Thank goodness for that. The people who clean the church really appreciate that we don't have to do that too. Okay? But we do have to accept the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. And we're going to see how that falls into this as well. Now, each commanded sacrifice was significant in some way. But all of the sacrifices that they're going to talk about, which there are several, there's the burnt sacrifice, the peace offering, all of these different sacrifices that are there. But all of these sacrifices that were there all point to the perfect sacrifice that Jesus would offer on the cross at his crucifixion. All of those sacrifices are pointing one place, to Jesus. Okay? This is why I say that you can be justified through the law because God will still honor that. God will still honor the old covenant. We can be justified through that. But why? It's so much harder to do things that way. Why not just accept the sacrifice of Jesus? Because that's where all the sacrifices point to anyway. Okay? So this was not the beginning of the sacrificial system. Right? We see the sacrificial system going all the way back to Genesis. Adam knew about sacrifice. Adam, when he came out and he and Eve were told God that they were ashamed because they were naked. And God, what did God do? He killed an animal to give them clothes. That was the first sacrifice for sin. Okay? It was the first sacrifice, and it provided a covering. Cain and Abel, they knew sacrifice. In fact, that's why Cain killed Abel, is because of a sacrifice. Okay? Noah knew sacrifice. What did Noah do when he came out of the ark? He made a sacrifice. First thing he did was build an altar and made a sacrifice. Israel, at the Passover while they were in Egypt, they made a sacrifice by killing the lamb and applying the blood to the doorposts. That was a sacrifice. Job 1:5 and Exodus 10:25 also mention burnt sacrifices before the book of Leviticus. So there were sacrifices before the law actually came down. So the idea of sacrifice to the gods was not something that was unique to Israel. Other nations and other cultures practiced that sacrifice. They practiced sacrificing animals, and ultimately a lot of them would sacrifice humans, had human sacrifice. So the universality of sacrifice is evidence that this concept was known to man way before the flood. Man knew about sacrifice long before that. And it was carried to different cultures. Because when you think about it, how else would other cultures get the idea to sacrifice to a god or their gods if they didn't get that idea from somewhere? Well, that idea had to come from somewhere. Where did it come from? Well, at this time, it came from Noah. Because when Noah and his family came off the ark, there was nobody else but Noah and his family. That was it. And they served the Lord God. So as people started expanding and growing and making more people, that's when things got complicated. All right? But they knew about it. All right? But since the sacrifice was already known to Israel, these instructions to the priests that they're about to get were not particularly new to them. They understood, okay, there's going to have to be a sacrifice somewhere along the line. These were most likely a clarification of the foundation that Israel already knew. They had the foundation of sacrifice because they'd been doing it. So they had the foundation of sacrifice, but here's a clarification on how it's going to be done. They knew that they had the foundations through their fathers, their forefathers, and they are now getting clarification on how it is to be done, so it's done the same way every time. So there's not just people willy-nilly doing sacrifices any way they want to. It's all being done the same way. Okay. Now, God planned bringing the law of sacrifice at this time. He said, I want to put if you're thinking, kind of get into God's thinking on this and say, okay, this is the time that I'm going to do the sacrifice. I'm going to implement the law of the sacrifice. Because before the tabernacle of the meeting was built, there was no one place for sacrifice. If they wanted to sacrifice, they had to build an altar and do the sacrifice then. Okay? And there was no procedures for sacrifice. Okay? So the sacrifices before this couldn't really be regulated or settled. But now with the completion of the tabernacle's done, Israel could bring their sacrifices to one place and one place only. And they followed the same procedure for every sacrifice. It wasn't something that one family did it this way, one family did it another way. Everybody did it the same way. Okay? Now, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus deal with personal or voluntary offerings. Chapters 1 through 5 are mostly instructions to the people who bring the offering. And chapters 6 and 7 are mostly instructions to the priests concerning the offerings. And the fact that God gave so much instruction on how to specifically offer sacrifice shows that this was not a manner that God left up to the creativity of the individual. He says, you're not going to do it your own way, you're going to do it my way. This ain't Burger King. You're doing it my way, or you ain't doing it at all. This is how we're going to do it. Okay? So they were not free to offer the sacrifices any way that they pleased. It had to be done a particular way. Even if they did it with sincerity, they may have been doing sacrifices or could have done sacrifices a different way, and they were sincere about their sacrifice. But God's saying, no, now this is the way that it has to be done. Okay? God demanded the humility and the obedience of his people in the sacrificial system. It had to be carried out in a way that it was God-centered, not man-centered. Had to be God-centered. Now, God tells him, he says, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd, and of the flock. This meant that an Israelite worshiper could not offer a wild or non-domesticated animal. They couldn't go out and get a wild rabbit, or they couldn't go out and get a wild animal somewhere and bring it in. They had to do it from their own flocks or their own herds. Okay? It had to be domesticated animals, and it had to be from their herd or their flock. You see, each animal was a part of the Israelites' inventory of animals for fabric, also for milk and all of its products, meat. Okay? All of these things came from the animals in their flock. So those animals had value to them. And giving to God of the herd and the flock meant that the sacrifice cost something. It wasn't something that they could just give and, well, we're not going to miss it. It's okay. That's why it had to be a domesticated animal from their flocks. You see, if they got a wild animal and brought it up there, what did it cost them? Nothing. Just the work of catching it, yeah. Okay? All right. Verse number 3. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. Now, the burnt offering, as it implies, of course, was completely burnt before the Lord. It had to be completely consumed by fire. It was a total sacrifice. And the burnt sacrifice was a general offering. And it was intended to make that person right with God once again. Okay? And it was done through propitiation, or the atonement of sin. And it was also done to show a particular or a special devotion to God, which is consecration. So they had to, they were doing it for the atonement of sin, or to demonstrate a special devotion to God in some way. They couldn't. It wasn't just. It wasn't just something. There again, it's not something that you're just doing. Oh well, I got to give so much. Like a lot of people doing offerings now. When the offerings come around, they put it. Oh well, it's just got to. No, it has to mean something. It's supposed to mean something when you do it. Okay. It's like George Washington on the $1 bill and Ben Franklin's on the $100 bill. And a $1 bill and a $100 bill was at a bank, side by side there. And the $1 bill looks over at the $100 bill and says, "Man, where you been?" He says, "Man, I've been all over the world. I've gone this place and this place and this place. I've been everywhere." He goes, "Oh, really?" "Yeah." The $100 bill says, "Where you been?" And the $1 bill says, "To church." Because when that plate comes around, we won't, it's easy to drop the $1 bill in there. Not so easy to drop that $100 bill in there, though, is it? Okay. Now the offering, the animal that was offered had to be a male animal, and this was done because it was thought that the male animal was stronger, and it was usually considered to be more valuable than the female. Okay? And the animal could not have any obvious defects to it, without spot or blemish. Had to be, obviously, everything had to be good. And God would not accept a defective sacrifice. It had to be without spot or blemish, because God didn't want them bringing the culls. He wanted to bring the best. And a male animal without spot or blemish is the animal that's going to bring the most money. If they had to sell it or did whatever, that's what's going to be the most valuable animal. To go out and just say, "Oh well, this one here is sickly, it's about to die anyway, I'll take it over and have it." No, that wasn't a true sacrifice. Okay. One of the priests, would examine each of the animals that was brought for sacrifice. They would go over this animal with a fine-tooth comb. And once they did that, once they went over it and looked at it, then they would attest that it had no obvious spot, no obvious blemish, no obvious defect. This demonstrates the principle that to atone for the sin of another, the sacrifice must be perfect. It had to be perfect. An imperfect sacrifice could neither atone for its own sin nor for the sin of another. And this wonderfully, wonderfully points to the perfect ultimate sacrifice and atonement of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was that sacrifice without spot, without blemish, was perfect, the perfect sacrifice. Because it was only the perfect sacrifice that could atone for sin. And Jesus fulfilled that standard perfectly, being sinless and a pure sacrifice without any blemish. Okay? Now, this demonstrates the principle that God wants and God deserves our very best. God didn't want the offering of the burnt sacrifice to be forced. He didn't want people to do it because they felt like they had to. Each animal had to be freely offered. Okay? If they decided not to sacrifice, that was their choice. They didn't have to bring one up. That was their choice. They weren't forced to make these sacrifices. They had to do it freely. And this illustrates the principle that God wants our hearts to be freely given to Him. That's why God gives us free will. So we don't have to make, or so we have to make the choice. We have to freely make that choice for ourselves that this is what we're going to do. Without free will, God could force every one of us to be a follower of Him, a worshiper of Him. Eh? But He doesn't. So much so, free will is so important, in fact, to God that He wants people He wants everybody and everything to have a choice in that He even gave the angels free will. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, He didn't know. The angels don't have free will. Yeah, they do. If they didn't have free will, a third of them wouldn't have followed Satan out of heaven. So they've got free will. They could choose to serve God or not to serve God. Now, why you would be in heaven around the throne of God and choose not to serve Him is beyond me. But that just shows how good Satan is at telling lies. Okay? How good he is at deceiving people. Now, the sacrifice was not to be made at the home of the individual Israelite. He didn't have traveling priests that went around. Remember, there's over 1 million Israelites there at this time. He didn't have the priests, the Levitical priests that were going around to each house and saying, okay, we're going to do things this way. No, they had to come to the tabernacle of the meeting. It wasn't allowed to be at any of the other high places. God could have said you have to bring your sacrifice to the top of Mount Sinai, but He didn't. That was a high place. That was a high holy place. That's where Moses received the 10 Commandments, and the law was there. But that's not where God wanted it. God wanted it at the tabernacle of the meeting. Okay? And God had appointed the door of the tabernacle an order for sacrifice. That was where sacrifice had to be made, was at the door of the tabernacle. All right, verse number 4. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Okay? Now, this is a clear picture of identification, with the animal to be the sacrificial victim, and through this symbol, the guilty person transfers their guilt, that person's guilt, to the sacrificial victim that was going to die. The priest didn't lay his hands on the animal. The person making the sacrifice had to lay their hands on the animal being sacrificed. That transferred the person's sin to the head of the sacrifice, and then the sacrifice was made for the atonement of that sin. Okay? And and that was the only way to make the atonement and be completely consumed for the sin of the one bringing the sacrifice. In other words, it had to be completely consumed by fire. Right? It was not enough that the victim merely died. The one receiving atonement had to actively identify himself with the sacrifice. In the same way, it's not enough to know that Jesus died for the sins of the world. The one who would receive his atonement has to reach out and identify himself with Jesus. They have to reach out to him. If you're going to receive that atonement, you have to reach out to him. Okay? It's been said, and I firmly believe it's true, that if there's 100 steps between you and God, he'll take 99 of them. But you got to take one. You got to take that step towards him. He'll get right there close to you, but you still have to reach out to him and take it. Okay? Now, the idea for the Hebrew word of atonement is to cover. The idea was that an individual's sin and their guilt was covered over by the blood of the sacrificial victim. When that sin was there, so that's one of the big differences between the sacrifice, the Levitical sacrifice, and the sacrifice of Jesus. In the Levitical sacrifice, the blood simply covered the sin. It was taken, you were atoned for it, but the blood simply covered the sin. Right? With Jesus and his blood, it doesn't just cover the sin, it takes the sin away. It washes the sin away. It casts it as far as the east is from the west. Right? And I know some of you have heard this before. East and west never touch. Do you know that? I can start going west. West. Gotta figure out where I'm at. West. Okay. I can start going west, and I can walk around the world, or I can fly around the world, or whatever. I can go completely around the world and come right back to this spot and always go west. Now, if I start going north, eventually, to come back to this spot, I'm going to have to go south. And then eventually come back north again. North and south intersect. East and west never do. So that's why Jesus said, I cast your sin as far as the east is from the west. Because they never intersect. Okay? Leviticus is the book of atonement. The word atonement, or the word for atonement, is used almost 50 times in Leviticus. 50 times in the book of Leviticus. Okay? It is used about 50 more times in the entire rest of the New Testament, or the Old Testament, I'm sorry. One book, 50 times in one book. It's used more times in one book than it is in the entire rest of the Old Testament. That's how important the atonement in Leviticus is. But there's a difference between the Old Testament idea of atonement and the New Testament idea. In the Old Testament, sin was covered over, like we said. And it was covered over until redemption was completed on the cross. Once that sin was I'm gonna get a little deep theological for you here. Hey, Curtis goes, no, don't. All right. Those people who made sacrifice and had their sins covered, and had the atonement made for the covering of their sins. All right? Those sins were just covered until Jesus died. Once he was crucified, then those sins were wiped away. Okay? Because they had been covered by the blood. Now they got the blood sacrifice of Jesus, and that wipes away all that sin. Right? In the New Testament, sin is done away with. It is a true at-one-ment that was accomplished by Jesus' sacrifice. The believer is right with God on the basis of what Jesus did on the cross, not on the basis of what the believer does. We can't work our salvation. We can't work our forgiveness. There's nothing that we can do. You and I can go out and we can kill all the animals we want to. We can sacrifice all the animals that we want to. It's not going to do us a bit of good. We have to accept that atonement that Jesus made. Okay? We have to accept what he did, because that is what makes the atonement. It's what Jesus did, not what we do that brings that. Now, significantly, the burnt offering was more about surrender to God than about sin. Yet this shows that when we come to God with the greatest surrender possible for us, we're still marked by sin. And we are in great need of atonement. All right? All right, verses 5 to 9. And we're not getting anywhere near done with chapter 1 tonight. Okay? And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priest, Aaron's son, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he shall flay the burnt offerings and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priest, Aaron's son, shall lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order upon the wood that is on the fire which is upon the altar. But his inwards and his legs shall he wash with water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. So, usually when we think about the sacrifice being made, we think they bring it over there, okay? The people, the person that brings the sacrifice lays their hand on the bull, whatever it is that they bring, lays their hand on the animal. That transfers their sin to the animal. All right? And then we picture it that the priest then kills the animal. But that's not what this is saying. The person that brings the sacrifice then kills the animal. Okay? They laid their hand on the bull, or whatever it was. They were the ones that were expected to actually kill the animal. And in each place, the laying of hands on the sacrificial victim is mentioned. The killing of the sacrifice by the one who put his hands on the head is mentioned also. So we know that it is them, the one that brings the offering, that has to actually do the killing of the animal. And the sacrifice had to die. The animal was without blemish, but that in itself does not atone for the sin. It wasn't enough that it was dedicated to God. It had to die to atone for the sin. Now, of course, the priest would assist whenever it was necessary, and the priest would do the heavy work, like skinning and cutting the animal up. But the one who brought the offering actually had to deliver the death blow. And the individual usually would cut the jugular vein of the bull in the presence of the priest of the tabernacle. Cutting the jugular vein is the fastest way to kill anything. As a matter of fact, by cutting the jugular vein, it's almost an instantaneous death. You'll think, oh, well, you got to bleed out and everything. No. If you cut that jugular vein, okay, or the carotid artery, it's an almost within seconds that you're going to die. And that's what happened with Charlie Kirk when he got shot. He got shot, and it tore the carotid and the jugular, and his death was almost instantaneous. Right? Your brain doesn't register. You're dead before your brain has a chance to do it. Okay? As soon as that blood flow is cut off to the brain, that's it. It's all over. Okay?
So
We all need to be right with God. You know, so it's a it's a fast. You're not going to get that and go, okay, I'm bleeding out, I got to pray and get right. No, you got to get right before that happens, because when that happens, that's it. It's over. Okay? So this was a solemn testimony to the need for sacrifice, a confession of the fact that I need atonement for my sin. This is the second occurrence of the phrase before the Lord in Leviticus. And it occurs more than 60 times after this. It occurs more than any other time in the Bible. What happens in Leviticus happens before the Lord. And every sacrifice that was made before the Lord. The blood of the animal represents the life of the animal. And it was sprinkled on the altar of the sacrifice. Then the rest of the animal, having been washed or from excrement or impurity or whatever it was, then it was burnt on the altar. The complete offering was burnt before God. And it said that it was a sweet aroma before God's throne. Now, if you've smelt burning flesh before, I'm not talking about broiling a hamburger or cooking a steak on the grill or anything like that. I'm talking about burning something. It's not a real pleasant smell. Okay? It's not slow cooking and it's not pleasant. But this was a sweet aroma, a savory aroma to God, not because it smelt good so much as it was the showing of the dedication that that person has and the willingness that they have to make that sacrifice. Okay? And this is stated for all aspects of the burnt offering. The atoning for sin and the giving of all in the obedience of God's instruction pleases God as a sweet aroma pleases our senses. Okay? Now, we all like the smell of a good steak cooking, or we like the smell of, you get that smell good stuff in your house, and, and women and men will go around spraying that foo-foo water on them, and, to make them smell good. And we like something that smells pleasant, right? And it's not, with God, it's not so much that it is the smell that is pleasant, it is the aroma, is the obedience and dedication that is so pleasant to him. And the Bible specifically tells us that Jesus fulfilled this sacrifice, the burnt offering, and he did it with his own offering, perfectly pleasing God and laying down his own life at the cross. We're going to end it there for tonight. Any questions, comments, concerns, amens, oh me's? Leviticus is very interesting.
Thank you for joining us today. We pray you were blessed by the broadcast. If you have a prayer request or questions about Solid Rock Tabernacle, please visit our website at www.solidrocktabernacle.org. That's www.solidrocktabernacle.org. On behalf of the pastors and congregation here at Solid Rock Tabernacle, we pray you have a blessed week, and we invite you to join us in person or on one of our future broadcasts.